Hello, UCLA Radio. This is Dr. No with the Bloop, and we have what's the first in studio guest of our entire time here, Professor Thaddeus Russell. You grew up in a you've alluded to this before, in a pot smoking socialist family that lived in black neighborhoods in Berkeley and Oakland. Nowadays, however, you report for New Reason magazine and appear from time to time on Stossel and Fox Business. How did you go from traveling in such staunchly left wing circles to these more right wing ones?
Well, first of all, I don't consider Reason to be right wing.
Oh, okay.
I don't consider much of libertarianism to be right wing. We can talk about that in a minute. But so I grew up in a very left wing, unusual, socialist, semi-hippie, countercultural, bohemian environment in Berkeley in the 1960s and 70s. And so that sort of got me involved in politics, got me interested in politics, although my parents never really actively indoctrinated me, but I was around it, and so I was very curious about politics. But I didn't know much about it. And when I got to college, I went to Antioch College in Ohio, which is a even more left-wing, hippie, countercultural place. My mission was to sort of understand what my parents' politics was. And I read pretty deeply in philosophy and Marxism and politics, and began to read about history as well, and began to become somewhat disillusioned, or I'd say uncomfortable in that world. And in some ways, it was really a kind of a personal cultural problem I had. I didn't like the people.
Oh, I see.
And I felt like a lot of people on the left, but I think this might apply even to some libertarians actually. We're sort of cut off from the physical, sensual, and emotional worlds. We're profoundly intellectual, and didn't really relate well to people in their immediate vicinity, although they claim to speak on behalf of the people, capital T, capital P. And so I just found it to be sort of an alienated environment. They were also sort of either indifferent to or hostile to popular culture, and I was very interested in popular culture, and indifferent to and hostile to things like sexuality and pleasure and freedom and fun. Saw it as sort of secondary to, quote unquote, more important things like institutions and economics. And I just felt that was sort of a limited worldview. I went to graduate school at Columbia University in the early 90s, and to continue this sort of project of becoming a good left-wing intellectual, and that sort of feeling of discomfort increased at Columbia, because now I was around sort of the cream of the crop of the world I wanted to enter, professional leftist intellectuals, and just got increasingly frustrated. And then I found that in history, which was my chosen profession, I found that the work that was being done by historians at that time certainly was overwhelmingly concerned with things like institutions and economics and formal politics and social movements, but social movements that were explicitly political. And there was very little interest at that time, this is the early 90s, in things like what people spent most of their time voluntarily doing. Most Americans, spend a third of their life at work, and then another third of their life doing things like watching UFC on TV or listening to Britney Spears on the radio. The vast majority of Americans are simply not political and not interested in the things that these intellectuals were, who claimed to be speaking on behalf of the people. And so I began to move politically a few years into my graduate school career, and became interested in things like freedom and pleasure, and I found like there was just no interest in that among leftist intellectuals. There was really no interest in freedom and pleasure. They were very much interested in things like equality, redistribution of power, institutional power, formal power, things like who controls the state, the relationship between capitalists and labor, all of which I consider to be vitally important as well, but it's only a part of life. And there's also a politics there. There's what I would call an ascetic politics, which is really, ironically, sort of a secular Christianity. It's the idea that one must sacrifice one's own freedom and pleasure for a greater good. And so I found that progressives and socialists both had essentially replaced God with the state or the community. And the idea there was that one should forego one's own interest in things like sex and drinking and leisure and fun for the greater good of the community. It's a profoundly ascetic philosophy, both progressivism and socialism, and it's ironically, I think, stems from Christianity, which they claim to be distanced from.
Yeah.
So I found the same sort of moral code on the secular left as one would find among Christians, and I found that to be it's not immoral. It's simply not what I'm interested in. I am interested in sort of I guess a fuller life. I'm interested in the sensual pleasures. I'm interested in people being free to do what they want, even if it is completely unproductive, even if it does not contribute to society. I find that, and I found that in my book, is very much about people who had no interest in contributing to society, and actually in doing that, in not contributing to society, but simply to their own pursuits, their own pleasures, their own freedom, they actually did enlarge our own freedom. They did enlarge freedoms for Americans generally and the world generally, and they made possible a lot of pleasures that were formerly illicit. So that's my journey.
Wow, it's a pretty cool story.
Good.
Yeah. So, considering that, we can see how you would come to write a renegade history of the United States, which I happen to have in the studio right now, my copy actually. And so, but I'm curious, what is there like a specific catalyst that made you decide like, I need to get this in book form? You know, I need to like organize this. I need to like just get it out there. Like, was there anything like that?
Yeah, I got fired.
Oh yeah.
After graduate school, I got a job at Barnard College, which is the women's college affiliated with Columbia. And I was teaching there full-time, but not tenure track. And I was given the job of teaching the American History Survey course. So all American history majors at Columbia and at Barnard had to take the course. And so this was lectures covering the Civil War to the present. And I developed in those lectures the ideas that became a Renegade History of the United States, and found that they were quite popular, that students were very interested in what I was saying. Faculty didn't know what I was saying in those classes. There's not a lot of oversight in academia. People weren't sitting in on my classes, except for students. And then a position came open at Barnard, which was exactly in the position I was teaching, that was tenure track and permanent. And of course, I applied for that, but one of the requirements for that was to give a lecture to the faculty. So they found out what I was teaching, and the talk I gave to the faculty ended up being a chapter in a Renegade, and it also became a journal article in a peer-reviewed journal in American Studies called American Quarterly. Half the faculty who saw it thought it was great, and half the faculty who saw me speak thought I was, quote, dangerous and improper, and should not, and had no place in academia. And the people who didn't like me happened to be fairly prestigious, powerful professors at Columbia who really sort of control tenure decisions at Barnard, and so I was let go. And I thought my academic career was over, and I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I thought, well, I have all these lectures, you know, maybe I could make them into a book. And I knew people in publishing, and I kind of floated an idea that was very vague at the time. And a lot of people in publishing were very interested, and I got an agent and sold the idea, which became a Renegade History. And that was that. So then I spent 2 years basically out of academia writing the book. Moved to Los Angeles during that time just to get back to California, because I'm originally from California.
Oh yeah.
As I mentioned. So it came out in 2010 and has been basically ignored by academics. There's been no negative response, there's been no positive response, there's just been no response. There's been nothing that I'm aware of published by, no published review or even response to the book by an academic. So the readership, the support for it's been almost entirely grassroots.
Oh, wow.
And I found that the people who like it the most, so far anyway, have been anarchists, countercultural people, and a particular kind of libertarian. Not all libertarians like it. Some libertarians hate it, in fact. But libertarians who I would call left-wing libertarians, and I guess if I had to pigeonhole myself, that's what I would call myself, as a left-wing libertarian. We can talk about what that means. But libertarians who identify with, or at least are in solidarity with, people who are out of power, outside of power. So workers and women and gays and blacks and immigrants, the people in my book, there are libertarians who identify with those people and take the side of them, and there are those who don't. And so the left libertarians have really liked the book a lot, and I included among them Reason magazine. So Reason chose the book as one of the best books of the year in 2010, and that began my relationship with them. I began writing for them, and now I do various things for them. I do interviews for Reason TV, and I write for them, and it's been a good relationship. So I've been introduced because of that to the world of libertarianism. I don't identify as a libertarian. I try not to. I don't want to identify as anything, and partly that's just honest, because I don't. My politics are I think essentially unique. I haven't found anyone whose politics are really identical to mine. But there's certainly a lot of overlap with libertarians, and also a lot of overlap with sort of radical leftists as well.
Yeah, although the two groups probably aren't so fun to admit that.
Yeah.
But so that's interesting what you say about, like, you consider Reason left wing, but a lot of people, like, they consider right wing. They'd be like, oh well, yeah, they support gay marriage and what's it called, immigration reform, but they're like they want lower taxes, so that makes them right wing.
Yeah, it's so it depends on. To me, it depends on what your argument for a free market is intended to accomplish, and what perspective it's coming from. So if the argument I make in the book, and that left libertarians make, is that the free market is the best system, not a perfect system, but the best system for working class people, for poor people, that it actually gives them more power over elite forces, over the establishment, than any statist model. That in a truly competitive market system, competitors are forced to give the people what they want, or they will die at the hands of their competitors. They will lose out in the competition. And so that is why, for instance, 10 years ago, virtually no one in sub-Saharan Africa owned a cell phone, and now a large majority of people in sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest people on earth, own cell phones, because there's actually competition among cell phone companies. They're very, very cheap, and that's true here as well. Virtually all poor people in the United States own cell phones, which is inconceivable in some ways, but it's true because it's such a competitive market. So the government is a monopoly, right? And that doesn't serve anyone's interest, and certainly not the interests of the poorest. And a monopoly can impose its will, can set prices however it sees fit, because it does not face competition. So it's really the people system. Now, that's not to say that it's perfect, and I take the side of, and this is what separates me from a lot of libertarians, in struggles between workers and capitalists over things like wages and working conditions and working hours. I take the side of the workers. That's who I'm in solidarity with. I want workers to have more money and fewer hours and better working conditions, because I'm a worker. That's what I do. I'm a professor, but we're workers too. And in fact, we're paid much less than a lot of people who clean the streets. So, it's why one pursues or takes the position of a market proponent that determines whether one, to me, is right-wing or left-wing. Right-wing, to me, means you're on the side of the establishment.
Okay.
That's, to me, that's my definition. It's not the correct definition, it's just the way I think of it. If you take the side of the establishment, if you think the great capitalists are the great men, and we should emulate them, and whatever they want is good, then I think you're right wing. If you think conversely, that the government is great, and a lot of people on the left actually think that they think that that the government in itself, regardless of what it does, is a good thing, is a virtuous thing. And to me, that's right wing. That's taking the position of
it sounds
power.
fascistic, kind of.
Well, yeah, it is, right? But it's taking the side of those who are in power. Institutions and the people who run them, who are in power, who run society. If you merge your identity with them, to me, you're right wing, and I have no interest in aligning myself with you. And so there's libertarians who argue for a free market from that perspective, from the perspective of the working class, who say that it's best for the poor and the workers. And then there are socialists who argue for a statist society, but at least they argue from a perspective of the working class. They are aligned with, at least in their own minds, the working class. They have no interest in supporting or defending the power elite. And so I think there's a huge amount of overlap actually among, and you kind of alluded to it a bit, among or between sort of the radical left and the libertarians I like, over a host of issues. I was on HuffPost Live a few weeks ago, and I was asked the question, on what issues can libertarians and the left align with over? And I came up with a list of about 15 to 20 issues, and these are major issues. These aren't small things. So, first of all, war, imperialism, wars of aggression, state secrets, surveillance, drugs, immigration, gay rights, corporate bailouts, corporate subsidies. There's a whole host of major issues on which libertarians and the left could and should align themselves. And you're seeing this right now with the whole debate over the NSA and surveillance. And in fact, a lot of right wingers, Republicans, have been saying lately that the reason that the NSA has gotten so much criticism, that this is such a major issue, is that people on the left, people like Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill, are happy to work with and support voices from libertarians, people like writers at Reason Magazine, who are very vocal critics, and so that actually is happening. There's a coalition, a left libertarian coalition, that is actually, I think, defending our civil liberties right now. I think that without that, we'd be in a much worse place as a society.
I see. Okay, well now, what's it called? We could go on like just this discussion is just really exciting, but what's it called? But we do have to move on to the book, because I want to get it in before, at least a little bit in before this interview's over. So so you mentioned that some of the material, it was taken from lectures you had given before. But I'm curious, how did you find the information for the lectures? Did you go to the library, ask for books on alcoholism and prostitution in colonial America? How did you go about that?
Yeah, so the book is it's what's called a secondary or synthetic work, meaning I synthesized, most of it is a synthesis of the work of other scholars. There's a little bit of primary research in it, but most of it you can find in other books. It's just that no one has ever pieced together all those distinct arguments into one overarching narrative and one overarching argument. And the argument is that the outcasts of society, the lowest stratum of society, the people we consider to be the scum of the earth historically, have, as I said, by their very existence and by simply avoiding social norms, created freedoms that Americans now take for granted. So, for instance, prostitutes in the 19th century. There was quite a bit written about prostitutes in the 19th century when I began the research, so I didn't have to do any of my own. But no one had really sort of pulled it all together to say what I say, which is that almost all of the rights, freedoms, and privileges that women now enjoy in the United States were first won by prostitutes, not by feminists. And it's quite a long list. So in the 19th century, respectable women did not walk alone in public without a male chaperone. Of course, the first women to do that and do it without shame were prostitutes, right? It was the shamelessness, actually. If you walked without shame, I mean, of course, some women who weren't prostitutes were forced to walk alone at night, but they were shamed for it. Now, of course, women are totally shameless about walking in public without a male chaperone, but that's what only whores did that in the 19th century. So they pioneered that freedom. They were the first women in the United States to earn wages that were comparable to or higher than men's wages. And again, they felt no shame in that. It was not okay. It was not okay for a respectable woman to do that. Prostitutes were the first to do that. They were the first women in the United States to own significant amounts of property on their own, not through their husband. Madams, especially in the boom towns in the West, became quite wealthy and ended up purchasing large amounts of property, especially real estate, in places like San Francisco and Seattle and Los Angeles and Denver. That was not okay for respectable women either. Now, of course, it's completely taken for granted that women should be allowed to do that. Prostitutes were the first to do that. Cosmetics, it was absolutely the domain of whores to wear rouge or mascara to color their hair. They were the first women to do that. This is well documented by many historians. It, of course, now is standard practice for most American women. But in the 19th century, if you looked like women do now, you were absolutely considered to be a prostitute. So there's a whole host of freedoms and privileges and what we call rights now that were won by those people. Now, prostitutes who did that, the vast majority of them, as far as we know, never thought of it politically. They never thought what they were doing. There's no evidence. I mean, maybe they did, but there's no evidence of any prostitutes in the 19th century sort of making statements about why wearing makeup was a political act or why walking in public was a political act. They just did it. It was just a behavior that was bad, that was considered to be quote unquote bad. And so what they did was they enlarged the definition of good by doing that. Simply by doing it, simply by breaking through the barriers around certain behavior, by demolishing taboos, they opened a space that we now enter freely. So all that evidence came from a host of books and articles written by other historians that were excellent, but it's just no one had sort of pulled it all together into a single argument about so-called bad women creating what we now all take for granted as good and free things.
Oh, God bless prostitutes then.
Yeah, right.
And also, well, about going back a little bit, probably beyond the book, beyond the substance. The book's title is like a reference to Howard Zinn's famous tome, A People's History of the United States, as you surely know. And you have also written articles about Zinn and made reference to him on several occasions. Would you consider him an influence on your work?
Well, I couldn't have written my book without Zinn's book. Or at least I couldn't have written my book without the sort of what's called new social history that Zinn represented. I mean, Zinn, like me, sort of pulled together a lot of other people's work to create one unified narrative. The arguments in his book were not brand new, but he pulled them all together into one story and one sort of overarching analysis of American history. So what he did was, and what the new social historians were doing at the time he wrote it, which was in the 1970s, they were overthrowing what we now call sort of old history or top-down history, which was, the history of generals and presidents and inventors and businessmen, and they replaced those guys, those old white guys, with a new sort of cadre of new heroes, and these new heroes were people like civil rights leaders and labor leaders and feminist leaders, and that was very good. I mean, it was very good that happened, because there was more to the story of America than what Thomas Edison and George Washington did. And it also showed that there was disagreement real serious disagreement about what America should be. So that was obviously crucial for me. I mean, I couldn't write the history that I wrote without that intervention that Zinn and the new social historians made. But what I found, because that was the generation that trained me, the new social historians, people like Howard Zinn, they trained me, and that's who I wanted to be originally. But I found in studying deeper these new heroes, these social movement heroes, these radicals, I found that they actually had the same cultural values as George Washington and Thomas Edison and the rest of them, which were what we now consider to be sort of conservative, traditional values, or you might call them bourgeois values. The ideas in particular that work in itself is virtuous, which is the Protestant work ethic. If you look at Martin Luther King, if you look at Charlotte Perkins Gilman, if you look at Eugene Debs, these great new, the leaders of the new social movement, new social history, the heroes of the new social history, they all shared the Protestant work ethic, and they preached it relentlessly to their constituents, to workers, to women, to black people. You will find among all of them basically a commitment to the nuclear family as the best, really only way in which to live, right? The nuclear family, the belief that the nuclear family is good, and the belief that work in itself, regardless of what you get for it, is good. Those, to me and a lot of historians, are the central pillars of American culture, from the Puritans to the beginning, to the present. So culturally, these people are actually quite conservative. And I'm talking about socialists and suffragists and, people we consider to be black radicals. I mean, they actually, in terms of their vision for how people live day to day, was identical to the way that Cotton Mather and Thomas Jefferson thought that we should live day to day. So that was very enlightening, and I mean, originally, initially it was sort of depressing, but it was actually enlightening and liberating for me, because I felt like, oh, well, there's yet another story to be told. There's yet another pantheon of heroes to put in the narrative. And so I said, well, who was Martin Luther King criticizing when he made these sermons about black people being shiftless and overly sexual and drinking too much? And I sort of looked at black working class culture and history, and right then thank God, a new sort of generation of historians, most notably a UCLA professor, Robin Kelley, had been doing this, and they had been saying, yes, as a matter of fact, the black working class in general, has been less invested in the Protestant work ethic and the nuclear family ethic. But what Robin and others have said is that may be a good thing. That may suggest that they actually know how to live better than whites have, right? There's nothing naturally good, even though Americans are trained to believe this, there's nothing naturally good about the Protestant work ethic. In fact, one may very well argue that that's not a good way to live at all. That the nuclear family is a very unusual way to live if you look at human history. Very few people actually have done that. It's very limiting. It's very repressed. It's very restrictive. And the black working class, for a lot of reasons we can talk about, having to do mostly with slavery and segregation, never had an interest in had less interest in adopting those norms, generally speaking. And now they've been criticized for it, but in fact we could, as Robin Kelley and others have said, and I say over and over in the book, let's say that's true, the stereotypes about black people are true, well, does that make them an inferior people or a superior people? And I'm suggesting that it might make them a superior people, or at least a superior culture. If you want to spend your life doing things other than working and taking care of children, and driving them to soccer games, then, the history of renegades, people who weren't interested in those norms, might be your heroes.
Wow, that's so cool. That's interesting. So, and I want to talk a lot of, I think you have a very controversial section about how black people, while they were enduring slavery, when they weren't having to do the work and they were being horrifically oppressed, they were trying to enjoy themselves. They were being so horrifically oppressed, but they didn't let that stop them from dancing, drinking, and all that stuff. And well, let me get to the final question. A lot of, and it's funny because a lot of white abolitionists, opposed to like slavery and other institutions like blackface, not because they were racist and oppressive, but because they like were perceived as exempting blacks from like social responsibilities that whites had to keep hold themselves to, like, and they celebrated leisure and sexuality. So like, were you taken aback by that, like that fact, or did you know it going in?
Well, I'm not exactly the first person to say that. So Eugene Genovese
Mm-hmm.
wrote a book in the early '70s called "Roll Jordan Roll: The World the Slaves Made," and he argued something pretty similar to what I'm saying in the book. Although again, he just sort of didn't pull it together into a quite as I would say coherent or unified argument as mine,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is that the United States, as a culture during slavery, is still considered by many historians to be possibly the most repressed culture in human history. So this is the era in which sort of Puritanism is merging with Victorianism, the 19th century, so the early and late 19th century, um, in which the Protestant work ethic is supreme, in which children are taught in schools from the age of 4 onward that play is bad and that work is good, that sex of all kinds outside of marriage is terrible, that masturbation is horrible. There was an enormous industry for devices that stopped people from masturbating in the 19th century. This is very funny, but it's true, and it says a lot about how repressed the culture was. And I'm not the first person to say this. I mean, this is what it's hard to find an American historian who would disagree with me that it was a highly repressed culture. So that was the culture for whites. That was the culture for so-called free people, right? People who did absolutely have legal freedom, formal freedom, legal power and formal power, absolutely they did. But their culture,
Mm-hmm.
the culture of America, the culture that required you to toe the line on work and sexuality and leisure, freedom and pleasure, um, uh, was awful from our perspective. So slaves, of course, were barred from that culture. They were kept out of it. Now, what's funny to me is that that's always been seen as a bad thing. Of course, it's not good to be kept from voting rights.
Oh yeah,
Of
definitely.
course, it's not good to be kept from equal protection under the law.
Mm-hmm.
It's not good to be kept from being able to drink at a particular drinking fountain. So, no one's arguing that that segregation was good. That owning a person as property was good. No one's arguing that. I certainly don't argue
Mm-hmm.
that. But the fact that they were kept from this awful repressive culture and, of course, had zero incentive to enter that culture, to assimilate into it as slaves, was quite beneficial for those people, and it allowed them to create things like jazz music, or the music that became jazz. Now, if you think about it, jazz, which is only one thing that was produced by essentially slave culture, jazz is the music of freedom. It's been called the music of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
It's very ironic, right? People have never sort of asked, well, how could that be? How could a people who are in bondage create the music of freedom? Jazz is based on improvisation, right? That's, if you know anything about jazz, that's that's sort of its definition is improvisation. It makes perfect sense to me, though, having done the research and thinking about it, that it could come only from slaves, people who were not managing the society, people who were not part of the managerial ruling class, people who were not a part of a culture that was so repressed as American culture was at the time. They were absolutely forced to work, of course, but, and I'm not the first person to say this, and even Genovese was not the first person to say this. Slaves worked clearly less than American farmers did, than white industrial workers did. Why? The racists said, and still say, it's because they were lazy. because they were naturally, biologically lazy. No, the reason is that they had no incentive to work well, that the whip can only make someone work well enough to avoid the whip,
Yeah.
right? So if you want to make someone work really well, really hard, either give them a piece of land and say, make your living out of that, which is what was done to American farmers, right? That will discipline the hell out of you. Or you get them invested in the idea that work in itself is good, right? If you believe that work in itself is virtuous, you will work all day, every day. And there's a lot of Americans who have that inside of them, the Puritan work ethic. So slaves didn't have that. They worked only well enough to avoid the whip, which, if you just think about the logic of it, and there's plenty of evidence to support this, was not enough to make them work well. W.E.B. Du Bois, the great black social scientist, said this first in the 1920s. He said, no power on earth could make us work well. They could make us work, but they couldn't make us work well. So, yes, so slaves did not have in their culture the Protestant work ethic. It didn't exist in Africa, in West Africa, and there was no reason for it to grow on the plantation among slaves. So they simply did not have that ethic, right? Same with the nuclear family ethic. It did not exist in West Africa. The idea that the only way to live properly was in a family in which there was mom and dad and 2 kids. They simply didn't have that idea. They had the idea that it was fine for a community or an extended family to raise children. They didn't have the idea that sex outside of marriage was bad, either in West Africa or on the plantation. So there you go. I mean, and they had no incentive to adopt these ideas, right? They had no reason to. So it makes perfect sense to me that those people would invent something like jazz, which is so liberated and liberating.
Yeah, and you also talk about, like, you connected to that, like how a lot of them, white, like a lot of whites, they saw like that culture, and they were kind of like, I want to get out of this repressive culture, and so they would they would celebrate, they would sing the songs, and then that led to blackface. And it's funny because now blackface is seen as racist, but at the time, like, a lot of it was like genuinely to celebrate. And even talk about, I think his name was Dan Emmett. Dan Emmett. He did the song I Wish I Was in Dixie, right? Yeah, he did that song like to celebrate black culture, and then like later on he found out that racists were like appropriating it as an anthem for the Confederacy, and he was like horrified. Like, so it's just like.
Right, yeah, so I do a lot on blackface minstrel shows, which was the most popular form of entertainment in the United States in the 19th century, actually all the way up until World War II. Historians generally agree that it was the most popular form of entertainment.
Oh, wow.
And as you said, it's now, almost universally considered to be just racist and anti-black. Now, a lot of it absolutely was racist and anti-black, there's no question about that. But what I argue, and other scholars have argued, I'm not the first, is that it also showed a tremendous amount of envy by whites for black culture. So if you think about it, what happens when you envy someone, right? You end up resenting them. You envy them, they have something that you want, but you can't have, which is the freedom to dance or sing or have sex outside of marriage or slack off at work and not feel ashamed about it. You can't have that. So you envy that, and then you end up resenting them. And so that explains to me racism, actually, anti-black racism. For me, the origin of anti-black racism in this country has always sprung from envy, as a matter of fact, which throws people for a loop, but I'm completely convinced of it. And if you look at the history of blackface minstrelsy, I think that's the best evidence. So if you look at the earliest blackface minstrelsy, which is in the 1830s and 1840s, 1850s, people like Dan Emmett, the lyrics of the songs are very clearly sympathetic and admiring of what they consider to be black culture. There's very little putting down of slaves and blacks at the time. That somewhat changed after the Civil War for various reasons. So blackface minstrelsy after the war did tend to be more sort of mocking of black culture. But even there, you see a tremendous amount of envy. Why would it be so popular to put on blackface and pretend to be black for a while? Why else would that be so popular unless there's something in there that is attractive to whites, right? Something that they don't have. I'm not the first scholar to say this. People like David Roediger and Eric Lott, very brilliant scholars, have argued this before I have. But so yes, we should think twice about what Miley Cyrus did before just sort of denouncing it as blackface minstrelsy. There's something in black culture that she saw that whites have seen for centuries that is something they want that they can't have. To be a good white person, you have to be tremendously repressed. That's still the case, I think. To be considered to be a good American citizen still, right, is to be a soldier and a worker and a family person. I think everyone agrees on that. That's how the formal culture, not popular culture, but formal culture, the things that politicians and teachers say to us, that's what it is to be good, a good American. There's something, especially in black working class culture, that Robin Kelly identified, that Eugene Genovese identified in slave culture, that is an alternative to that is liberating and attractive to whites and has been for centuries.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. The driving force behind racism would be envy. Like, I mean, like, if I brought a whole bunch of like people here to like work for me, like for no pay all day, whatever, and then I just come and I see them like dancing, drinking, like, and having sex and like just having fun, I'd probably be pretty mad too. It's just like I never thought of it that way. It's really crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is it's not that. So that a lot of people get confused about what the Protestant work ethic is. It is not working hard to get more money. It is not working hard to get a BMW or a flat screen TV or making the football team. It is not that. That's work, which is a means to an end, and that's actually the idea that slaves had about work. It's a means to an end. Yeah. It's not a good thing in itself, right? It's the idea that work in itself is good, and you see that promoted still very much, very strongly in our culture. So pretty much every politician I've ever heard of, you look at their speeches, they extol the work ethic. They don't say, it's great that Bill Gates worked hard so that he could become a billionaire. It's great that Bill Gates worked and created these things for others. It's a communitarian ethos, actually. It's working hard for the community or for God or just for this sort of abstract idea of virtue.
Yeah. And moving a little bit along, a section on recreational shopping details like how both like more traditional conservative millionaires like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and progressive economists and feminists like Frank Straithoff and Bertha Richardson were opposed to it. What was so quote unquote bad about shopping, that just shopping for leisure, that it could bring such seemingly diametrically opposed groups together?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of people, especially people on the left, think of Americans and American culture as being so pro-business, pro-capitalist. Well, as a matter of fact, American culture has always been very much split on that question, split on capitalism. American culture, at least formal American culture, has always been very supportive of the disciplinary side of capitalism, the side that requires you to work, to get up at 7 a.m. every single morning, and to make yourself into a machine and sit in a cubicle or work in an assembly line all day long. Formal American culture loves that part of capitalism. American culture has, generally speaking, formal American culture, again, the politicians and the business leaders and the teachers, etc., and the generals, has been pretty hostile to the other side of capitalism, which is the consumption side. They love the production side and hate the consumption side.